Welcome to the Dyslexia Overview video designed for middle and high school staffs. I am John Waters, Director of the St. Louis Regional Professional Development Center. This video was created by the St. Louis RPDC to fill a need for professional development about dyslexia for secondary staff. We're delighted to share this video with you and staffs throughout Missouri. We hope it is a valuable learning experience for this important work to help students with dyslexia succeed.
This video is intended to be a 2-hour experience with learning about dyslexia, processing, and reflection time built in to the experience. The purpose of the video is to learn more about dyslexia, including an overview, definitions, characteristic, brain research, screening, accommodations and interventions, and a featured piece on assistive technology. The expected outcomes for this experience are to understand what dyslexia is and is not, to be able to identify characteristics of dyslexia, to determine what accommodations would help students with dyslexia at the secondary level, and to think about some interventions that would be helpful to them. For more in-depth information, there are several documents on the DESE website under dyslexia, including the DESE guidance document that includes more information on screening, on accommodations, on professional development, and several appendices that might be helpful to you. In addition, there are several other documents, including the professional development options, frequently asked questions, and the screening organizer. Before we discuss the definition and characteristics, take a few minutes to jot down your ideas about what dyslexia is. You can include what you think the definition is, or characteristics, or anything that you can think of about dyslexia.
At this point, we want to talk a little bit about what dyslexia actually is. You will see dyslexia referred to as a specific learning disability. However, at this point, we do need to make sure that everyone understands that dyslexia is not all students with dyslexia will end up being students with disabilities under IDEA. So not all of the kids who get identified in screening as having some kind of difficulty with reading, not all of those kids are going to end up being kids in the special education program. We'll talk just a little bit more about that in a second, but you also need to know that dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. There is definitely some kind of different activity that goes on in the brains of students who exhibit these types of characteristics, and it's not just a choice that they make. There truly is something neurobiological going on. There's a lot of brain research that has been done in the last 20 years to indicate that. It is characterized by difficulty with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So think for a second about students that you've had who don't read very fluently. When they read out loud, it's choppy, or by the kids who have poor spelling. Those are kids who probably would fall onto the dyslexia spectrum in some way, shape, or form. They typically have difficulties from what we call a deficit in the phonological component of language. So it is a language-based disorder. They have difficulties that are unexpected in relation to what it seems like their cognitive ability should be and what they probably should be able to do. So these are the kids in your classroom who seem very bright, who, if you talk to them, can talk about lots of topics. They have lots of interests. They can tell you about lots of things. But when it comes to actually having to read or to do written language kinds of tasks or activities, they struggle. It also carries some other consequences. Reading comprehension. Dyslexia is a disability in basically decoding words, understanding those parts of language. And when you can't decode at a fluent rate, especially at the secondary level, it is absolutely going to affect your reading comprehension. So you will see that as a secondary consequence for most kids that have difficulty with, that masks that dyslexia kind of, those dyslexia symptoms. They're going to have probably a lower vocabulary ability. Again, for the same reason, when you struggle to read, you don't read very much, and therefore your vocabulary may be diminished, your ability to understand words may be diminished as a result of that. So those are some of the secondary consequences that you are going to see. Dyslexia is difficulty with that phonological processes of language. If we look at break down the word dyslexia, we come up with the prefix dys, dys, means difficulty, and lexia, the word lexia means language. So clearly, even the word itself tells you that students who struggle with these types of issues have difficulty with language. They have difficulty processing and manipulating all of these, the pieces and the parts that go into language, like oral language. They might turn things around when they say them. They may not say them exactly in the right context or the right stream that you might think they should. They have very much difficulty hearing the sounds of words. If you break words apart, look, at, for the word cat, they may have difficulty hearing the beginning, middle, or end of that word. They have, obviously, those things play out when you're trying to learn to read, because reading is based in the phonological processes, and so they're going to have difficulty with that, which also, as mentioned before, shows up in written expression and spelling. If you can't hear the sounds of the word, it's going to be very difficult to spell the word as it sounds, so they're going to have some difficulty with that. As mentioned in the definition, dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. So the slide that you're looking at on the screen, where it represents the brain, depicts what has to happen in anyone's brain in order for reading to take place. You can see all the different colors, all the different pathways, all the different things that have to work together. You have to have access to vocabulary meaning. You have to have visual parts of the brain triggering at the same time. You have to have the language parts of the brain triggering. You have to have the hearing part of your brain all triggering at the same time in order for reading to actually take place. So again, as mentioned, it is neurobiological, and you get a disruption in any one of those pathways and you are going to struggle to read. There is brain research out there, PET scans available, all kinds of imaging available to show that students who struggle with reading actually do have differences that are occurring in those neuron firings and those synapses that are taking place in their brain. So this is real. It's not something that kids make up. It's not kids being lazy. This is a real thing that happens for a number of kids, actually more kids than probably anyone realizes at this point.
The characteristics of students with dyslexia come from the definition. So if you look at this slide of elementary characteristics, you'll notice that on the left side of the slide are a lot of characteristics you would typically see in younger children or students in elementary school. So things like not being able to tie their shoes or tell time or delayed speech. Some of those are much more characteristics of younger students. However, if you look at the right side of the slide, many of those characteristics carry on into middle school and high school. So for example, students will still have trouble following multi-step directions, learning new vocabulary, retrieving words, memorizing things, processing speed, and working memory can still be major issues for students in middle school and high school. Some of the characteristics that you will notice in secondary students that are unique maybe to middle school and high school students are difficulty decoding multisyllabic words, so words that have many syllables that are common in most content area classes. Many times they need to read text many times for comprehension. As was mentioned earlier, fluency can be a problem, so if you're not fluent when you read, sometimes you have to read the same sentence over and over to even get the meaning. Oftentimes, another characteristic is distinguishing what's important. They'll either tell you that nothing was important in a lecture or everything was important in a lecture, but that also carries into reading, not just listening, in that they may have trouble figuring out what are the main ideas and details, just what's important to remember from anything. So that also carries into poor memory for facts, dates, names, difficulty summarizing, paraphrasing, making inferences, And then many times what you'll notice is their written expression really shows a lot of problems. So it can be spelling, editing, mechanics, just, overall poor written expression, like much lower level than you would expect, especially from talking to them or hearing them talk in class, and then you see what they write and it just looks dramatically lower level than you would expect. If you ask them to read aloud in class, they will often read in a choppy manner, or they just are very reluctant to ever read aloud. They'll try to get out of it in any way they can. And then also other work, test scores and other work don't match their verbal expression. In addition to the academic characteristics, you will also notice a lot of social, emotional, behavioral kinds of characteristics, particularly as students, if they don't get enough intervention or they don't get enough assistance, they will become pretty learned helpless or learned hopeless. So you may see declining or already declined stamina, motivation, persistence. You may also see behaviors that are really kind of coping behaviors. They clown around in class, they distract others, they are reluctant to even begin a task or do a task. And it can even manifest itself in depression and hopelessness. And a lot of those coping characteristics can make them seem like they're doing fine, like they're charming and funny and, just have different personality characteristics that make them seem like they're doing fine, but that's really just to mask all the difficulty that they're having.
Students with dyslexia also exhibit some relative to very good strengths that we need to be, as teachers, paying close attention to. Very often these kids have great verbal skills. They are good out-of-the-box thinkers. They're good problem solvers. They have great people skills. They are creative. They're musical. They're talented in many other ways. They are often gifted in math, in other kinds of technical skills, in some of the mechanical or computing skills. We need to be sure that we're paying attention to those skills for these kids who struggle with reading, because these are the kinds of things that will keep them interested in school. And so it's important that we pay attention to the things that they do well. And very often those are the skills that will keep them motivated to come to school. It's important to note that 1 in 5 kids are somewhere on that dyslexia spectrum. It works just like all other kinds of disorders that we might see in society, where you have kids who fall in all different areas. You will have kids who will fall on that very light end of the spectrum, who will show a little bit of weakness in some of the reading areas, and then you're going to have kids who fall all the way on the other side of that spectrum, who are very, very definitely impaired with all of the weaknesses and all of the issues that are going on with them in this world of dyslexia. The majority of the kids who exhibit those characteristics are not going to be kids who qualify for special education. You're going to have maybe the last fourth of that spectrum that are actually going to qualify, and you're going to have the rest of that spectrum who are going to be in your classrooms and who are going to need some kind of support in order to be able to access the information, to access education in the best way possible. So it's important for all of us to understand that that's our jobs as teachers.
A dyslexic brain works like a jigsaw puzzle. Not everything fits together to make a seamless picture. It looks mostly correct, but not quite. When I spell a word, the letters might be out of order, or I'm using a wrong letter. When I hear the word finger, I hear TH, not an F. When a teacher gives me an assignment, I can only read about 75% of the words right. It takes me twice as long to read the words than my classmates. It's hard for me to scan the sheet to look for the answers.
So as you know, 1 in 5 kids have some types of dyslexia. It is more where the brain has a hard time attaching meaning to a letter. So when you're hearing a sound, you don't attach that meaning to a letter to create a word, and then backwards to look at words in order to make sounds to understand what you're reading. So it makes it very difficult for the kids to break that code. And so it's important to teach them a little bit differently how to do that.
Okay, now it's time for you guys to do a little bit of reflection. Find a partner, or if you're at tables with not more than about 5 people, then use your whole table to talk about these questions. How are your perceptions of what dyslexia is now compared to what you knew or thought about before? So, given all the information that we've just gone through, what's changed your thought about what dyslexia actually is? Or maybe it didn't change your thought. Just have a quick conversation with the people at your table about those kinds of things. The second thing we'd like you to talk about is, can you think of any students you have or have had in your classes who may have exhibited these characteristics of dyslexia? And as a side to that, what did you do about that? What were any accommodations or things that maybe you yourself put in place because you noticed that the kids were struggling? So quickly at your tables, have a conversation about those 2 questions.
One of the best ways to understand dyslexia is to actually experience what it might be like to have some of the characteristics. So in this simulation, we're going to ask you to do several things. You'll need a piece of paper and a pencil or pen, and you'll need to follow the directions that I'm going to give you. First, you're going to write some sentences with your non-dominant hand. So whichever hand is not dominant for you, that's the hand you're going to use, and I'm going to dictate the sentences to you. Ready? Here's your first sentence. Peter went to the store for milk. Peter went to the store for milk. The next sentence is, Jason and his father argued over homework. Jason and his father argued over homework. Okay, think about what it felt like to use your non-dominant hand and also to try to write sentences while I was dictating them. In a few minutes, we're going to ask you to reflect on that, so just kind of think about what that felt like. The next activity is to write 3 to 4 sentences. This time you get to use your dominant hand, so you can switch to your dominant hand. Write 3 to 4 sentences about what you did this morning to get ready to come to work. Did that seem a little easier? Think about why that might have been easier besides using your dominant hand. What else made that task maybe a little easier? And again, you'll reflect on that in just a few minutes. Now I want you to think about what you did yesterday morning and write 3 to 4 sentences, but you can't use these words. At, to, from, this, of, for, and for every T that you write, you have to make it a B, and for every O that you write, you have to make it an A. So follow the directions on the screen if you can't remember what I said, and write 3 to 4 sentences about what you did yesterday morning. Please take a few minutes with your partner or your table to reflect on the questions that you see on the screen and really think about how the simulation made you feel. I want to talk a few minutes just about screening at the secondary level. The purpose of screening at the middle school or high school level is not to result in a diagnosis of any kind. It is really just to identify those students who have characteristics of dyslexia and who may need supports, interventions, accommodations. In the guidance document, there is much more information about screening. For example, that all students have to be screened K through 3 starting this fall, and including kids who transfer from other schools in Missouri and outside Missouri. But for our purposes, really all you need to know is that screening in grades 4 through 12 is based on whether students are having experience or if their parents refer them for screening. The role of secondary staff really is to look for those characteristics, to see how students are struggling in class, to see if they fit any of the characteristics we've talked about so far, to maybe discuss students with colleagues, especially if you think they're struggling in your class. You may want to talk to your colleagues about whether they're struggling in other classes also, and then to refer them to some kind of student staff support team, whatever you call that in your school, or to a school counselor or anyone who normally would take a closer look at students who are struggling. What you might look for include all the characteristics we've already talked about, but even things like reluctance to read aloud, choppy reading, written work, it looks very disorganized, messy, lots of errors. Their writing has very low level vocabulary or low sentence construction compared to particularly how they talk in class or their verbal expression in class. And even sometimes, at least in my experience, I saw a student in 9th grade who was still writing with his paper upside down and backwards. So I immediately looked at that student to see what other characteristics he might have, because it's kind of rare for students to still have those problems with directionality in the 9th grade. And in general, just if their work doesn't match what you see from them in class, their other work, verbal work, or just anything that you see in class doesn't match what they do on paper, would be a good thing to look for.
Once a student has been screened and has been identified as having some of those characteristics that we typically think about for kids who have dyslexia, then it's our responsibility to put something in place to try to help that student. There are a variety of things that can be done. So in this section, we're going to talk about the differences between interventions, accommodations, and just academic supports in general. What we need to understand is that something does need to be done when you identify kids who are struggling. At the secondary level, it's less likely that we are putting interventions for all of these kids in place. However, we do need to think about that. And the difference between an intervention and an accommodation would be an intervention is actually going to teach the skill. We're not intervening by moving kids' seats to the front of the room or by giving kids something on tape. That's an accommodation that is helping the student access the information that all the other kids are accessing in your class. So we need to know the difference between those two things. Academic supports are all of those things that we might be doing for a student. We might be having them go to another room to get some instruction in reading. We might be putting these academic accommodations in place. All of those things fall into the area of support for the kids who are struggling. It's also important to note when we are looking at what do we need to do for students who are struggling, that the interventions, the accommodations, the supports, whatever we put in place, those things absolutely must be matched to the student's need, to the skill deficit. It doesn't do us any good to intervene or to accommodate for a skill that the student isn't struggling with. We need to be sure that we are matching it to the skill that the student is actually struggling with, and that takes some thought. The slide that you see on the screen right now demonstrates how the idea between interventions and supports, typically supports meaning accommodations, basically switch as kids get older into the upper grades. We start out in the K-3 world of doing a lot of intervention for these kids who are struggling with these skills, with the idea that we want them to learn the skill, that we want this to get better for them. As they get older, if we haven't completely remediated those skills, what needs to happen then is that the supports pick up more along the grades 4 to 12. The supports are going to pick up for those kids so that they can continue to access the same material that all the other students are accessing, but they're going to do that maybe in different ways, which means you're going to accommodate in some way. They're either going to have things read, they're going to use text-to-speech, some other way that they're going to be able to access the same kind of skills that all the other kids are accessing. When considering the types of accommodations and supports that need to be put in place for students who are struggling, we need to be thinking about several things. We need to be thinking about what is our learning objective. We don't necessarily want to change the objective of what you're teaching in your classroom when you're accommodating for kids. You just want to be thinking of what are some alternative ways that kids can demonstrate what they know, demonstrate mastery, just demonstrate that they are actually learning the material that you're teaching. We want to make sure that we try to keep that as close to grade level as possible. It is also likely that for some kids you may have to be looking at some lower level type reading material or something along that line, but you want to try to keep it as close to grade level as possible. Hence, the way you accommodate may move into that more technology world so that they can stay as close to grade level. We want this to be a positive experience for these kids too. Let's remember that when you struggle to learn, when you struggle to read, that doesn't always give you a positive view of school. So we want to try to make these accommodations as positive and as useful as we can for the kids, and not make it such a big deal that they feel singled out or that someone's picking on them or something along that line. We also want to consider that kids do not have to have an IEP or a 504 plan in order to get any kind of accommodation that is going to help them access the material that you're teaching in your classroom. This goes directly to what is the climate in our school for making accommodations. Very often, we hear people say, well, I'm not making that accommodation for this kid. He's going to have to do it the same way everyone else does it. That just doesn't make sense in this day and age. School is about learning. School is about kids accessing the material. They do not have to have an IEP, a 504 plan, in order for us to make accommodations that help these kids learn the material that we are trying to teach them in our classroom. I'm going to mention just a few of the more general kinds of accommodations that you can use for kids who are struggling in some way to learn. I also want to make sure that you know that there's list upon list upon list of these types of accommodations in the guidance document that you can find on the DESE website. I believe that was mentioned earlier. But just a few of the more common things that we can do for kids is to accommodate maybe timing of how much time are they going to get to complete an assignment. Possibly for kids who are struggling with that writing piece, possibly giving some kind of an accommodation for the note-taking. Possibly giving accommodations for the way things are being read to them or the way students are supposed to access the material in the textbook. All of those are some very general kinds of accommodations that you can do, and as mentioned, there are lists upon lists upon lists, and you've probably heard all those kinds of things before. The difference is going to be that now we need to pay attention to what types of accommodations are going to work for what kids, basically go back to what is their need and how do I accommodate for that need. Some of the things that you might do in the world of math, again, the timing in math is an issue that we may need to accommodate for kids. We may need to let them use a calculator for math facts. We may need to use graph paper for alignment. So if they struggle with the handwriting pieces or with being organizationally challenged when it comes to putting stuff on paper, graph paper is one of those things that might help with that. Lots and lots of other accommodations that you can do for math, and they are listed on that guidance document if you pull that up. Just in general, for content or elective classes, you might want to do some accommodations in the world of vocabulary. It's important for those kids to know the vocabulary that you need in those content classes, but simply having kids look words up in a dictionary is probably not going to be the most beneficial way for those kids to learn that vocabulary. Some kids are tactile learners, giving them options for the way that they might display what they know for you. Maybe they do it orally, maybe they do it with a project of some sort. Those kinds of things are all good accommodations for kids who struggle with the writing pieces or the reading pieces of an assignment. You can think through those kinds of things.
Teachers often recognize a need that they see in students and may even discuss it with other professionals in the building. For example, in high school where I taught, one of the geometry teachers realized that a lot of kids were having trouble with the amount of reading in geometry and a lot of the processing of the language in geometry. And some students even had some problems with spatial relations and other processes that influence geometry. So what he decided to do was create a lab class for geometry in which the students had maybe 3 days of, it was typical instruction, but then they also had a couple of days of lab experience. So it was all kinesthetic, manipulatives, that kind of process that they could actually experience the geometry. And then he took it one step further and collaborated with the industrial tech teacher who was teaching woodworking and lots of other industrial tech classes, and they actually decided to have a class, part of the class that was computer assisted drafting, and it was a way for the kids to see how geometry works in the real world and how it can be used to design buildings, design construction. Since then, I have noticed that many states actually have these kinds of classes. And Missouri, I noticed yesterday in a news story, has that type of class where they actually build a house. So I think a lot of times teachers can just recognize a need and start thinking about how they can adapt for students, and it may even grow to be something that's national.
One of the strategies I used when I was teaching was to preload vocabulary and text structure for students who struggled with reading on grade level. I was a middle school teacher. I taught with a truly collaborative team, and what we did is we would start the year by taking texts that students were going to need to access. We would ask the science teacher and the social studies teacher to go through and to identify vocabulary that would be really important for the students to have in order to access the text. And then as the ELA teachers, what we did is we also identified academic words that they needed. In addition, we would actually set up a graphic organizer that matched the text structure. So at the beginning of the year, we were heavily scaffolding this process. We would preload the vocabulary, preload the text structure, have the students ready before they actually started the learning in that area. You know, one of the frustrating pieces as a middle school content teacher is you have textbooks that are actually written above grade level. And we have students every year, just like you do, who come in and they are reading below grade level. What we found with this is that as the year went on, we could remove some of those scaffolds. We started having the students identify vocabulary that they thought might be important, and we created a bank of graphic organizers that kids could use, where they could actually go and choose a graphic organizer that might fit what they were doing. We found this to be highly successful. Students who were initially reluctant to participate in class often really wouldn't try to read the text. They actually started raising their hand, offering answers, digging into the text so that they could use the graphic organizer. So we felt like this was a good structure for us.
We know that extra processing time supports students who have dyslexia. And there's a really simple strategy that you can use in any classroom with any grade level, any content area. It's an oldie but a goodie. It's called Think, Share, Write. That is great in supporting students with dyslexia, and it really works great for all kids. It's just what it says. The first thing that you do is you pose a question that's going to require some thought, and you instruct the kids to take about a minute of think time. They're thinking silently. They can draw and doodle while they're thinking if they need to. After that minute of think time is up, then you ask kids to turn and share their thinking with someone near them and to listen to a partner's shared thinking. Again, they can add any ideas, doodle while that's happening if that supports their learning. And then the final step is to ask them to write their thinking. So now they've had processing time, they've been able to think through something, they've been able to say their own thoughts, hear the thoughts of others, and now they're writing. You could also add a step in there for drawing. A lot of students with dyslexia are actually very strong in their visual, their visual strengths, and so they can take time to draw their thinking, and then if needed, share their thinking with you and someone can script for them.
They tend to be very much big picture thinkers, then they don't see details, and that's why when you're working with them in math class, they may not recognize that there's a negative sign in the problem that you're working through. So what you can do to help is making sure that you're using highlighting. Highlight that negative sign, as it travels through the problem, so then that way the student can follow through and recognize that that's going to affect the answer. The other thing too where you can use highlighting is highlighting in different colors in social studies, for example. So if you're learning about World War II and you have to follow what the United States is doing, the Soviet Union, Japan, and Germany, have each one of those countries be a different color, and then as they have done things, being a part of a battle or did a certain action, that you highlight in that specific color. So that way the student can scan back through that sheet to be able to see, okay, this is everything that was connected to the United States, or this was the things that were connected to the Soviet Union.
I'd like to switch roles for just a minute here and talk about what a difference it made for my own daughter when a teacher, a high school math teacher, on her own just decided to make an accommodation for her that absolutely changed her perception of math and what she was able to do in that class. My daughter does have a diagnosed learning disability, and she is likely dyslexic. But it started to show up in math class when the test had a lot of reading on it, and the teacher noticed after one particular test that my daughter could talk about this stuff in class, could answer the questions in class, but when it came to taking the test, she was bombing the tests. And so after, again, one particular test, she said to herself, something's not right here. This is not this girl. She knows this information. So she called my daughter back into her room and she asked her what happened. And my daughter said, the questions don't make any sense when I read them. The information just doesn't make any sense. I can't keep it straight. So the teacher on her own said, we're going to try something. And she read the test and the questions out loud to my daughter. And she ended up moving from a failing grade on that test to getting an A on the test because she did know the information, and she simply could not get it out when she was trying to read the questions. She just could not make sense of what it was asking her. But when the teacher read them and explained, some of the stuff in a little bit of a different way, she was able to give her all the information that she could give in class for that test. So from that point forward, on her own, that teacher decided that she was, from this point forward, going to give my daughter an oral math test. And took time during her plan time to call her out of a learning lab in order to give her that opportunity to show what she knew.
I would like to share a grading system that consists of time as the variable. In this grading system, there are only 3 grades that a student can earn, and that is 0, 80%, and 100%. And within this grading system, the assessment is made up of maybe 4 to 5 standards, where each standard there will be maybe 4 to 5 questions or items per standard. So the test would consist of about 20 questions. The beauty of this type of grading system is that students have the opportunity to retake tests, and they can have up to 3 chances to improve their grade. So if they made an 80%, they have an opportunity to make 100%. And as I said, the grades, there are only 3 grades: 0, 80%, and 100%. So if you have 5 standards on your test, you would need to get, 4 out of the 5. So, for example, if students wanted to retake a test because they got a 0% and they could have missed maybe 2 of the standards, then they would retake the test only testing those items under that standard. So they're only testing the unmastered items. And they would have to qualify to take the test by completing all homework or any other practice lessons or activities to help them to prepare to be successful on that retake. And I have found this to be very helpful for all students.
It's my pleasure to talk a little bit about two high school examples of how you can not only help students with dyslexia, but help all students be academically as good as they possibly can be in high school. I worked in a large Missouri high school in St. Louis that had an 8-block schedule. And during that schedule, we had what was called an academic networking period, which met every other day for 90 minutes. And during that time, we helped students with makeup assignments. Students were able to go see teachers to get extra help. Kids that had a project, 3 or 4 kids together that had a project could work on it during that time. And it was a place where students could also get some homework done. We felt, teachers in that school felt that we needed to be more prescriptive with our help, but certainly, and what we did was get academic help in each of the various academic areas. We also tried to help students with homework completion, and we tried to make sure that they were getting their work turned in to all their teachers in terms of getting communication back from those staff. Another example that I want to press forward is one in Illinois, where we were a smaller high school, and during that particular school schedule, we had a 7-period day, but we also had a 30-minute advisory period during that time. And we tried to use that time for the same kinds of things that I'm mentioning to you that we did in the school in Missouri. We tried to get kids help, we tried to do makeup work, we tried to have groups work together, and we tried to, again, be prescriptive about what things we thought students should get to be able to be the most productive they possibly could be in high school. So I guess what I'm saying is you don't have to be specific to dyslexia, you have to be specific to helping students. And if you come up with a schedule that fits your school, the reason I gave you the 2 examples is we all have different schedules, and so you need to adapt it to what your schedule could be. But I think giving kids help during that time, being prescriptive during the school day, is especially helpful in schools which have a lot of busing to school, a lot of activities after school, and during that school day you need to get to those students that actually need the help, because that's the best time that you can help them.
At this point, we'd like you to take a few minutes to again talk to your partners at your table about the types of accommodations or supports that you may already be using for kids, that you're accustomed to doing for students. Possibly other people at your table have some other ideas of things that they've done, but take a few seconds just to chat about the types of things that you are familiar with and the types of things that you may have also seen that kids could use. You just weren't sure that it was okay to do that for for students if they didn't already have some kind of a plan.
One of the most appropriate ways to support our secondary students is through the use of technology. And we can do that through assistive technologies, but I want to talk about technology that is appropriate for all students, any students that are sitting in our classrooms. We want to look at the student and make sure that we have some data that supports the kind of supports that we're going to put in place. We also want to look at the environment and what the barriers might be within the environment, the tech tools that are already in place, the platforms that are already in place, the laptops, the mobile devices, if we're working with Google for education, iPads, those kinds of things. We want to make sure that we're putting tools and supports in the hands of our students on the tools that they are already working with. We want to look at the tools that are already in place, that are already in our classrooms. We want to make sure that we are supporting the students with the tools that they already have access to, easy access to. If they have iPads, if they have their own mobile devices, if they are using Google Apps for education, we want to make sure that we are putting the supports within those tools. If we can take the information that we have about our students and the problem areas that they're having problems in and match the tools to those areas, then that will give us a more intentional service plan. We can use tools like text-to-speech, dictation, leveled text, display accommodations, writing tools, and note-taking tools. We're going to look at text-to-speech now. This is digital text that's read aloud by a device. This is different than audiobooks. Audiobooks is text read aloud by a human. Sometimes our students can get caught up in the digital voice, but this is something that can take some time to learn and to get used to. So if we look at three different platforms for this, we're going to look at Google. And on Google, you can download or install a Google extension. And the one that I want to talk about is Read and Write for Google Chrome. This is a software that you can attach to your browser, and it's going to take the text on the screen and read it aloud for the student. This is free for all students. This is also free for educator accounts as well. I'd also like to talk about text-to-speech on any tablet. This is a free feature on most devices if you are able to go into the accessibility settings and enable it. A web-based version of text-to-speech would be Natural Reader, and you can go to their website and watch a tutorial on the software and use it within any web-based browser. Let's talk about dictation. This is your spoken words converted into digital text on a device. In Google, you can use this within Google Docs and Google Slides. It is available in Google Slides in the presenter notes. You can then take your presenter notes and copy and paste them into your Google Slides. You want to enable this within the Tools bar, and it's under voice typing. You can also use this on any tablet. It's a free feature available on most devices. You'll want to check on this in your accessibility features. And then on a Chromebook, you can use this with your on-screen keyboard. You would need to enable voice typing on your on-screen keyboard. Another way to support our struggling readers is to provide them text on their independent reading level. And the way that we can do this within Google is through the Snap and Read extension. It has a simplify feature. The Read and Write for Google Chrome also has this as well within the premium features, and the premium features are free for teachers but purchased for students. On the web, we can use rewordify.com. This is a website that you can go and paste text into and then select the appropriate level, and then it automatically re-levels the text. This leveling feature is also available and built in to some websites like newzella.com or readworks.org. I'd also like to talk about accommodating for the display. This is changing the font, the size, the spacing of the text. Also cleaning up the screen so that there aren't a lot of distractions on the computer screen. So within Google, we can use the In overlay extension. This changes the color of your screen. In Read and Write extension, there's a visor feature. And then there's the Mercury Reader extension, which cleans up the article or the text on your web page so that it is free of distraction. Beeline Reader extension is also available, which changes the font as well as changes the colors within the sentences. Sometimes the words are different colors, the letters are different words to help to be able to see the differences between the letters within the words. On a tablet, you can change the color of your screen. In Safari Reader, you have within your Safari browser, you can tap on the Safari Reader to clean up the web page just like you do with the Mercury Reader extension. It reduces the distraction on the web page. You can also enlarge the font size within your iPad settings. Another great free tool for students and teachers is Microsoft's Immersive Reader. This can be used on Office 365 in Microsoft Word and Microsoft OneNote. This has a lot of great features but one of my favorites is how it breaks the words up of a text, any copy text or written text, into syllables. It also has text-to-speech built into it with highlighting, so the students are able to follow along easily. Another powerful tool is word prediction. This is software that suggests words as you type. Co-Writer Universal is available for Google and for tablets. This is a free feature on a tablet if you're able to enable it on your keyboard. On a Chromebook, the on-screen keyboard has word prediction as well. Some tools to help with the mechanics and conventions of writing would be an SAS Writing Reviser add-on. You can find this within Google Docs. Read and Write Extension has great outlining tools, and then the Verity Spell add-on will help with our students who struggle with spelling. When students are working on a tablet, they have access to a dictionary. This is going to be found within the settings, and you may have to install a specific dictionary on the device. There is also Inspiration Maps app, as well as the Snap and Read app is available on iOS. Read and Write has a keyboard. This is a third-party keyboard that's going to assist the students as they write by predicting words. A note-taking support that we can use with our students for Google would be Google Keep. This is going to help them to be able to take notes on things that they've read and to be able to jot their thoughts down about passages that they've read. On a tablet, you would be able to install Notability. Notability and Google Keep, you can use Dictation as well to be able to voice your notes or your thoughts. On a desktop, you can have two windows open side by side, reading on one window and then also note-taking on your second window that's open. So take some time at your tables to think about the technology that you have available and how it can support your students.
As we close this overview of dyslexia, remember that as educators, our goal is to build on students' strengths. It is important to ensure that their strengths, not their weaknesses, define their lives. The top 5 actions we can take as secondary teachers to assist students with dyslexia are to identify students who are struggling, refer them for screening, provide research-validated interventions, make accommodations to meet their needs, and build upon their strengths in each of your classes. Take 5 minutes at your table to think about what you've learned and how your perceptions about dyslexia have changed, and how you can support students with characteristics of dyslexia in your classes. To learn more, here are some of the resources that you may want to investigate. Many of these were used to prepare the content of this video. Our goal is to help all students experience the victory of success and the peace of feeling good about themselves. We can meet this goal by collaborating within our schools, talking to each other, to counselors, administrators, special educators, reading teachers, coaches, and other specialists. Please contact Bev Colombo at the St. Louis RPDC, your RPDC dyslexia facilitator, or Kim Stuckey at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for more information. Thank you.